Hey there, my name is Trail, and today I'm going to show you how to make this half-shell Deadpool mask. Hey look, my mouth moves. Ah! For this project, I used the foam Deadpool mask template from Greg Enriquez over at Propway. I'll have a link in the description down below so you can go check out his video. However, I am going to be making this as a face shell. I started with a full shell, but I'm going to get to the half shell later on in the video. For the full shell version, I used my own head measurements and scaled the pattern the way that Greg recommends. In my case, this ended up being 105% scale. For both of them, I started with the eyes first. I cut them out, making sure to follow the designated angles on the pattern. Then I used my wood burner to go down the line at the top of the eyebrow to give it that angled fold. Instead of a wood burner, you could also use an inset V-groove cut using a regular X-Acto knife. Then I glued them together and used my rotary tool to sand off the rough edges and try to smooth out the general shape. From there, without connecting the eyes, I started assembling the rest of the pieces the way I normally do, starting in the center and working my way out. I finished constructing the rest of the helmet by adding the side pieces and the last two pieces at the very back of the head. Now that I had the full face shell assembled, I was ready to see if my eyes would slot in the way I wanted them to. And there was just a little bit more friction than I would have liked since they weren't glued in there from the beginning. So I had to go in and remove a little bit of excess material so that I could get those eyes to fit without running into the edges of the mask. You may not need to do this, but if you're going to, just make sure you go slowly and carefully so that you still have that nice edge-to-edge contact without having a super loose fit around the fabric that will eventually be going over this shell. Now we're ready to actually connect the eyes, and for this we're going to be using neodymium disc magnets. As you can see, I'm going to be putting a little bit of a bridge around certain edges of the eye slots so that I can place those magnets and have one on the shell side as well as the eye side. In order to actually get those magnets to fit in place, I'm going to be swapping out the bit on my rotary tool for this cylindrical stone grinding bit, which is not quite the size of the neodymium magnets, but just a little bit of circling out from a push straight down into the foam will give me the size that I need. However, if you're going to use this same technique, make sure you don't go all the way through the foam. I'm just using 5mm here, and these magnets are only about 3mm thick. Then it's just a dot of super glue in each of the holes to connect the magnets, and then good old contact cement to get those bridges onto the inside of the face shell. These first two bridges were able to just go straight across the angle of the hole, but as you can see for these next two, I had to actually extend them out into the space in order to be able to connect. Then I did the exact same thing to the back of the eye pieces, and as you can see, we've got the magnets here in the back, and now we have successful contact with the face shell. After that, we can turn this foam helmet into an actual face shell, and the main difference there is that we don't need a finished surface, so we can drill holes into this foam so that we have some ventilation underneath the fabric that's going to be going over this face shell. I put the holes in the front mouth area and over the ears for better hearing, but you can honestly put these wherever you want, on the forehead, the temples, anywhere for improved ventilation, anything to make that helmet less hot. It was at this point that I decided to make the stunt eyes. Now, these are the same as the regular eyes, except that I took out the centerpiece and modified the bridge just a little bit for a little extra space. And then at this point, I tried on the whole thing, did a quick test fit, and I was happy with the overall shape and the way that it fit, but I was still pretty sure that I wanted that half shell mask for the moving jaw. So I went ahead and put this to the side and got started on the half shell. For the half shell, I reprinted the template and cut out where I wanted the edge to be. Now, in this instance, you're actually going to have to print the template 5% smaller than you would for the full helmet because it has to fit closer to your face. The second time around, I still constructed the full helmet. However, this time I added an overlapping edge at the bridge of the nose to sort of mimic the detail in the movie. I then sketched a line all around the helmet, approximately where I wanted that edge to be, and then carefully cut it out all the way along with my X-Acto knife. Something else you're going to have to keep in mind with the half shell is that you're going to have to sand down all of the outside edges. This is because you're going to be stretching a fabric mask over it, and you're going to have to make sure they don't stand out. This next part is optional, but for those of us that do not have as prominent of a chin or jawline as Ryan Reynolds, you may want to include it. Using the bottom half of what I just cut off of the helmet, I created a chin prosthetic that can go under the half shell. Now, obviously it needs to stay on your face somehow, so we're going to have to glue an elastic strap onto the back of the chin. I used one long strap to go all the way across the back, but I also sewed a cross strap along the top in order to offer more of a cup at the back of the skull to try and secure it in place. To sew this in, just do a square around the intersection with an X in the middle, and it should hold that very solid. And of course, I made a pair of stunt safety eyes for the half shell as well. Now that we have both versions of our solid face shell, it's time to move on to the fabric pattern. I adjusted the original foam pattern to create these fabric pieces. Some of them needed to be more adjusted than others, so it was a combination of moving the actual pattern around and comparing measurements to the size of the physical face shell. Once I had my pattern pieces, I transferred them onto a gray test fabric. I used a 1/2 inch seam allowance, leaving extra room around the eyes so that there was plenty of overlap in the fabric for the magnets. This seam allowance made me realize that I needed to tighten up the edges of these patterns as it fit the full shell perfectly, but not the half shell. For the first of the red fabrics, I'm going to be trying to recreate this textured look. I transferred my patterns onto a red nylon spandex. This time, instead of marking out a 1/2 inch seam allowance, I marked out a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but was planning to sew it as a 1/2 inch anyway to tighten up those patterns a little bit. Once I had my fabric pieces cut out, I cut out larger pieces of a checkered grit mat. This is going to be the stencil, essentially, for that superhero pattern that's going to be painted onto the fabric. Using a light strength spray adhesive, spray one side of your grit mat. Give it time to dry until you can feel that it's sticky, and then apply the right side of your fabric onto the grit mat. Flip it over so that the grit mat is on top, and then very lightly spray your darker spray paint color over the mat. This was a test, which is why I used spray paint, but you could also do this with an airbrush. This is what it looks like if you want to try to recreate this look, although I ultimately ended up going with the red textured fabric that you're about to see me actually construct the mask with. For my mask, I went ahead and used a dark red thread, although what color you use depends on how much you want your stitch lines to show up. I set my sewing machine to stitch number 4, which is the narrow zigzag stitch, so that it sews like a straight stitch, but still has stretch to it. All of the seams on this mask are going to be a double top stitched seam, meaning once we get our first seam, we're going to press the seam allowances open and go back over either side about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch from the actual seam and sew those edges down. Then flip it over to the inside and trim as close to that seam as you can to get rid of any excess fabric on the inside of the mask. I constructed the fabric pieces very similarly to the way I like to construct my foam pieces, connecting all of the pieces down the middle and then putting the sides on, starting with the lower face seams and then the full length head seam all the way around the back. However, I wanted the invisible zipper to be hidden in the right back seam, so I only sewed that side up until the cross edge stitch. As you can see, now that I'm putting the zipper in, I'm switching over to a zipper foot, and I started where I left my last stitch, where I've got the closed end of the zipper up at the top, and I have it facing face down on the right side of the fabric, getting that connected as close as I can to the zipper itself. The thing that I hate the most about invisible zippers is having to work around that zipper head, but you'll manage it eventually. Then I closed the zipper back up and started all the way back up at the top where that seam had ended so that I could work my way down to the edge so as not to create any uneven bunching in the fabric. Now that we've got both sides of the zipper connected, we're going to have to take off part of the sewing machine in order to be able to get in there and actually finish our seams. As you can see, I've pinned over the fabric on the outside of the zipper so that as I go back over it, I will get that same top stitch look to match all of the rest of the seams on the mask. Once again, I had to work around that annoying zipper head, so I ended up opening the zipper at about the halfway point and just finishing off the seam with the zipper half open just on that one side. Once that invisible zipper is in, this is how it should look, and you can see it really nicely meets up with all of the other double stitching. Now that we've got our face shell and our fabric mask, we can move on to finishing up the eyes. I used this outdoor window screen, but you can check out my previous video if you want to see some other options for materials you can use to get that comic book superhero look. I spray painted white onto one side of the window screen, but ultimately this didn't want to cure on whatever plastic it was coated in, so I just painted white acrylic over it afterwards. Then for the foam eyepieces, I just gave them a nice coat of black Plasti-Dip because I wanted them to have that sort of leathery look from the movie without having to actually glue a faux leather fabric onto the foam. Once the paint was dry on both of them, I cut out the general shape for the eye fabric and then just hot glued it onto the back of the foam, making sure to get that glue through the holes of the screen so that it had a nice solid bond. Then I did the same thing for the stunt eyes. I gave them a good coating of black Plasti-Dip for that same look, but this time I hand painted the eye shape onto plain black screen. I only wanted to get the outline of the white eye itself because I wanted to have the same look, but I wanted the entire inside of the hole to be screen so that I could see through the whole thing with just a little extra visibility. Then I glued it onto the back of the foam the exact same way as the regular eyes, making sure that hot glue had a nice strong bond. And there you go, that is the finished Deadpool mask. And there you go, that is the half shell and full shell version of the Deadpool mask. As I said, ultimately, I'm gonna be sticking with the half shell for the purposes of this cosplay. It's just more comfortable. I like the closer fit to my face, and I really like being able to have that jaw move. It just really adds a lot to being able to embody the character while in costume. I did include that chin detail just in case you want to include that for your own if you try to replicate this, but I'm not personally going to be using it. The comfort that I get from not having that chin strap on outweighs the little bit of benefit that it offers. You might mess around with it, it might end up working for you, but I'm going to be sticking with this half shell without that chin strap. So far, it's been working pretty good for me. Now, this isn't quite finished yet. I am thinking that I want to do a little bit of airbrushing. I'm just going to be doing some light black shading following along these seam lines, trying to dirty it up a little bit and kind of help the details pop rather than just having that flat red. Also, something I forgot to mention in this tutorial, the name of this fabric that I used is Bullet Textured Stretch Liverpool. If you want to get this same look, that is the kind of fabric that you want to look for. Now, if you're wanting to fully follow along with this tutorial, I'm going to do my best to have a digital template of my fabric pattern down in the description or somewhere in the comments. I'm gonna have that available to you for free since I based it off of Greg's pattern. And speaking of Greg, please go check out Propway, check out his channel. It is a great tutorial. It'll give you a bit more of an in-depth look at the process of putting this foam version together. And that is also how you can find this same template that I used. Big shout out to Greg for that template. It was a big help for me to not have to draft this pattern up myself and helped speed up the whole process. That being said, If you're going to do both of these together, then just scale both patterns at the same percentage. For this half shell, printed it at 100%, no size modifications for my 24-inch head, and the pattern will be scaled the exact same way. So if you're gonna print the foam pattern at 100%, print the fabric pattern at 100%, and then, like I said, add a 1/4 inch of seam allowance, but still sew it at 1/2 inch so that it tightens up those edges a little bit. I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a like on this video if you found it useful or just enjoyed following along. And I am going to be making more tutorials as I finish this full Deadpool cosplay. So if you'd like to see the rest of those, then go ahead and hit the subscribe button so you can see those new videos, and I'll see you in the next one.